I'm going to ask Peter to just keep facing forward. I'd like to do a straw poll, please. I'd like to know, hands up, show of hands, who thinks that Peter will be able to get through this lecture without mentioning STI? Hands up if you think he will manage that. Right, well, that is fairly unanimous. You weren't supposed to look, Peter. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Peter Mapp to give us the Warren-Barnett Memorial Lecture this year about psychotic acousticians. Lots of interactive demonstrations, I understand, as only Peter knows how to do. So I'm just going to hand over. Thank you, Peter.
I guess that makes me the chief psychopath then, that's about right. Yeah. The way I'm feeling, that's probably about right, actually, because we had a little rehearsal before when you were having coffee, and it blew my sound card. So all the sound demonstrations have gone out the window, I'm afraid. So we'll only do it in vision, but we get there. I'm really so honoured to give this lecture because it's in the memory of two people that had a big influence on this industry, although they go back a long time. But I was also quite privileged to work with both of them on several projects, so it was quite a thing. The other thing is we lost Ken Dibble this year as well, so I think it's worth just remembering him as another stalwart of the industry, and again had quite an influence on it. Okay, so psychoacoustics for sound engineers. What's it all about? Well, it's some of the stuff I won't be discussing today, but there again I might, because I've run out of stuff because the demos have gone. So let's get kicked off. When Helen rang me and she said, could I talk about psychoacoustics? I thought, an hour? You know, I mean, I could do, you know, after 10 minutes, you've done all the gags, you know, you've done the sort of getting into the saddle and the spokesman and all that stuff and getting into the frame and all those. I never tire of that one. So, anyway, luckily, when it was written down, it came to me, it was actually psychoacoustics, which is just as well, because I think I can do an hour on that. But actually, it's really interesting, because this one goes back, I don't know if you can see it, goes right down to 1 hertz, or 1 cycle, that speaker. Thank you. They do get worse. Have we locked the door? Okay, right. So, let's kick off. Psychoacoustics. It's sort of really about how we hear things and how the brain interprets them. And I want to talk about the interpretation of the sound, not so much the sound itself, but I do have to talk about a little bit about the ear, just to sort of put the whole thing in context. The thing is, we all hear sound differently, and it amazes me that you can actually set up a system and people actually think it's all right, because we've all heard something quite differently. Some people will hear distortion, and others won't hear it at all. Some people will hear an echo. Other people will not hear it at all. So how the hell do we set this stuff up? And it's a bloody good job I'm doing this at the end of my career, because if I gave this lecture at the start, I wouldn't have joined this. I'd have become an accountant, because audio is far too difficult. But a lot of what we actually hear are due to learnt reactions and interpretations. We spend our life actually learning what we're hearing. Some of them get it right, some of them don't. And they've all been to concerts that haven't got it right. So if we look at the range of hearing, it's all right, I'll carry on another 5 minutes at the end if you're late. No, I've got plenty of stuff to do. So if we just look at the overall range, it's an absolute massive range we cover, from sort of 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, plus or minus a little bit, and depending on how old you are. But within that, there's quite a range. So that's the kind of the speech range in the middle here, and then the music bit, and then we go from right down the threshold of hearing at 0 dB, or in fact, actually less than 0 dB at 4K, up to 120, 130. It's a massive range. So let's just have a quick recap of the year. I don't want to go through this in any detail at all. We've done that. So let's look at the threshold. And the thing is that our hearing system is totally and utterly non-linear. You couldn't imagine a more non-linear system if you tried to invent one. It doesn't matter if it's in terms of amplitude or frequency, or in fact other domains as well. It is completely and utterly non-linear. And therefore, people actually say, and a number of times I've heard it, oh, when the room gets going, or when this happens, or when that happens. No, it didn't. It's your ears. The system could have been flat, but your ears don't think it's flat. So again, how the hell do we overcome that? I'll get onto that in a minute. Anyway, so we've got this range, and if you look at the threshold of hearing, so we're going from sort of 0 dB, by definition, that's what 0 dB is. But if you want to hear the same sound at, say, 60, you've got to have 60 dB. You've got to be 60 dB louder before you can even hear it. That's a really strange system. And in fact, what you can do is a whole series of curves called the equal loudness curves. And what you do is you actually listen to various sounds and you match the loudness of various frequencies at the same sort of level. And it really is quite astonishing when you look at the variation between, say, 1K and then the lower frequencies, how much more level you want, 60, 70, 80 dB more to actually hear it at the same level as you're hearing at 1 or 2K, which is huge. And that has huge implications in when we're actually setting up systems and when we're listening to things. And the trouble is, we don't think that. We think it's a straight line. I should have done that. I must make a note. That's a bloody good diagram. But we think that it's straight. We don't really appreciate that. Now what you can do, you can see here there's an odd curve. And if you invert that curve, that's actually the filter, if you like, that the ear's using. And again, now you can see the low frequencies are really rolled off. And if you happen to look at the 40 FON level, then that actually matches up to the A weighting curve, and there's the A weighting curve. It looks a bit strange because of the scaling of that, but that is the A weighting curve, and the idea was to try and match the inverted 40 FON curve, and that's where that comes from. Because it was realised if you just measure linearly, you don't get any correlation at all between the sound we hear and how loud it is or whatever, and what's going on. And in fact, there's a whole series of those curves. You look at them, and in fact, the A weighting is around about the 40 FON curve, as you can see. The B weighting is up there at 70, and the C weighting, which is the other one you'll see on the sound meter these days, is around about 100 dB. And you can see it's a lot flatter. I mean, it's flat down to here to sort of 100, and then it drops off if you invert it, whereas the A weighting is doing that. So as we hear louder and louder sounds, we actually hear the frequency balance change. So how do you set up a system and get it flat, or whatever shape you want? And there are the curves sort of plotted out and morphing. You used to get meters with B on them. It was a good idea in the 60s. I mean, these curves go back to about, I think, about the 50s. And the early sound meters actually had A, B, and C curves on it. And then depending on the level that you were measuring, you actually had to change the scale. And it got so complicated, and people get different answers. So it all became A weighting. So now we use A weighting for everything, although it's completely, utterly wrong. But at least it's consistently wrong. And there's nothing like being consistent. So that's what we are. Just to sort of change the things slightly, you may see this curve. That's actually the CCIR. The reason I put that in is that cassette tapes are coming back, apparently. They're now being released, and that's how you measure the noise and the hiss off a cassette or something. And it was deliberately designed to emphasize the high frequencies and the hiss to do it. And there's the A weighting curve. You can see why it's sort of there. And so I actually had to get my meter out and dust it off because I was measuring some cassette decks the other day, and it's really quite intriguing what goes on. I was going to do a demo of wow and flutter. You wouldn't believe what you're listening to when you play a cassette back. You really wouldn't. Just shows how tolerant the ear is and many things. So let's just go back to the ear and have a quick poke at it and just see where it all comes. Let's talk about the outer ear first of all, which is really this bit here, the concha and the pinna, and then also into the ear canal, because that has a really interesting frequency response. If you were to measure the frequency response, so if you had a flat sound out there and you measure it at the eardrum, then it actually does that. We have a big increase, we have a gain or resonance of about sort of 3-4 kilohertz of up to 15 dB, which is a massive peak when you think about it, and that's just due to the resonance of this tube and the ear and the way the shape of the ear is outside, and that has a big influence later on. Now that's if you were putting a sound straight into your lug hole at 90 degrees. If you were to play it in a diffuse field, so you're now hearing it from all around you at equal levels, you get a slightly different curve. Now at first glance you think, well, there's not much difference, but they are slightly different, and in fact, so if you try and remember that, I plotted the two together. And now you can see there's a lot more high frequency where you've got the diffuse field, which is not surprising because now your ear is collecting all of that sound. And that immediately, again, poses the question, okay, am I setting up this system with direct sound coming in my ear at this angle, or am I going to set it up because it's diffuse and I'm hearing sound from all around the room? Because I get two different responses. By the way, I'm only asking questions. I'm not giving any answers. I'm just going to give you away totally confused when you leave this place. That's the whole objective of today's 4 hour, what is it? 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock, I thought you said, yeah. Talk. Oh, don't believe me, I can keep going. So, I'm just asking some questions. Now, let's have a look at the middle ear, where the little bones are. And if you were to measure from the eardrum now through to the cochlea, so you go from the round window, the oval window to the round window, or whichever way around it is, you actually end up with a curve that's like that. And now you can see we've got attenuation. So we had gain in the first part of the ear, now we're actually losing it all, and we've got quite a lot of attenuation. Again, look at how the low frequencies are attenuating, but then it's sort of reasonably flat at sort of mid frequencies. And now, if you can imagine all those mathematicians in the room, you can take the one curve, like that one. Ooh, what's happened there? Come back. So you can imagine if you take that curve with some plus, and you take this curve with some minus, what do you end up with? Well, all right, I'll tell you because I did it for you, because it intrigued me. I've never seen this. I mean, it's in some books, but I've never seen it. I had to figure this out for myself. Wish I'd done this 20 years ago. I mean, it's so much easier. You end up with that if you add those two curves together, which is really rather interesting. So we get some gain at sort of 2 to 4 kilohertz, and we get a roll-off at low frequencies, and we get a roll-off at high frequencies. That looks remarkably like the 40-font curve I showed you earlier on. It looks remarkably like the A-weighting curve. So now you know where the A-weighting curve comes from, although it's wrong. It's actually because of your ear. It's because of the two parts of your ear actually doing that. Now this is before it gets to the brain, and that has a go at scrambling it. This is just physically the ear doing stuff. And also, don't forget, I said everybody hears something differently. If you take one of these curves, just say you were trying to do this one, you could add plus or minus 10 dB onto that to cover the standard deviation of most listeners. So we're all, this is all average. So by definition, sound is average. Or not. Think about that one. So as I said, we don't have a flat frequency response, yet we think we do, which is kind of interesting. It also gets different at louder levels. So how can we tell a persistent response? I've already done that bit. And I'll leave you with that thought. You can all go to lunch with that in your mind. Because I ain't going to tell you. Ooh. The reason we know it's flat is we learn what a flat response sounds like. If you were to go out, you probably can't remember the first day you ever played with a sound system or anything, but what you do is you learn how sound should be. You learn how a system should sound. I can remember doing, back in the, several decades ago, doing a lot of hi-fi reviews, and we actually had a panel of listeners, and we all sort of, after a while, gravitated to what was a notionally flat loudspeaker response or whatever. We all knew, we all started to understand what flat sounded like, as opposed to peaks and stuff. So you can learn this stuff. You can actually train your stuff. You can listen to responses that are flat or squeaked around and whatever, and you'll learn it. So that's how we do it. One other thing, so I just talked about frequency, just a very quick look at the time. The longer a sound goes on, the louder it becomes. Up to about 125 to 200 milliseconds. It's all over by 200. It ain't finished at 100, somewhere in the middle of the two. It gets louder. So what happens is, in fact, if you've got a shorter sound, it has to be louder to sound the same than a longer sound, up to about 200 milliseconds or so. And those actually, just out of interest, are the sound level meter time constants in there, just to see where they are. And they all flatten out at about 125, 200 milliseconds. There's no difference. So again, depending on the length of the sound that we're hearing, we're going to hear it in a different way. And depending on you will hear it differently to you will hear it, because of the way we hear. And that's some of the reason, I'm just giving you some of the reasons, why when we set up a sound system in a sort of a concert hall or a concert, do we like putting this big bass peak on the bottom end? Everybody does it. Well, obviously, as I said, equal loudness, we want to hear the bass. It doesn't sound flat, although actually it could be flat. That sounds flat at reasonable listening levels. Now, once you actually turn the volume up, it no longer sounds flat, but sounds boomy because of the thing. So really, you should set the system up to the level that you're going to play it at. And what's interesting is, I mean, this has been the trend for the last sort of 15, 20 years around the world. What's really interesting is that currently a lot of the people setting up systems, the main mix engineers, are now setting this flat because they actually want a flat sound, and then they will go from there. So again, they're training themselves, they're learning what flat sounds like. And it's sort of interesting that if you're designing a concert hall, you tend to actually try and get the RT to give a bass boost. You don't design it with a flat RT, you actually have more reverberation, therefore it sounds louder, therefore you have more bass. So again, we've kind of experienced that. And that's there for many reasons. Basically, can't get enough cellos and double basses in most rooms to actually get enough level. So we actually do this artificially. So the room does that. That's great for classical music, for cellos and for double basses. That is not a good idea if you're going to put heavily amplified sound through it. That's the worst thing you can possibly do, actually. Not a good idea. This is some results of an interesting little experiment that was done by Sean Olive over in the States a while ago. He's been very interested in looking at frequency response of speakers and headphones. And if you look at the top curve, this was the average of a load of untrained, if you like, lay listeners, just people who had an interest in hi-fi. And they actually could set the response of a system to how they wanted to sound. And the average was this. So we now have a 12 dB or so bass boost and some sparkle at the top end, for want of a better word. But the trained listeners, who were the core that actually did all their work and listening work, actually set it down this curve here, the dotted line, the dashed line at the bottom. So in fact, just a tiny little bit of bass, and so actually the top end was rolled off because that actually properly sounded flat if you compared the two. So it's very interesting that amateurs and professionals, if you like, will actually set a system up differently. We want to hear the boom and the tiz, but actually it gets very fatiguing and tiring after a while. So after a while you actually come back and drop it down a bit, which is kind of interesting. So these curves really do work. I want to move on and talk about sound localization, because again, that's something else that we do a lot in this business. And laterally, we are incredibly sensitive to sound. We can get within 2 or 3 degrees of a sound in a horizontal plane. You can localize it all the way around, which is pretty precise. Luckily, or not, in the vertical plane, it's 15 plus. 15 is the absolute best you can do. It's usually about 15, 20 degrees in that plane there, which is why we can put speakers above screens, we can put it in a theatre, we can put a central cluster up high, because we're not very good at distinguishing where the sound comes from. And once we got a visual cue to pull it down, or we do some other tricks, that's fine. You couldn't do that horizontally. So we now have another thing is, so where the sound comes from, actually, it sounds different as well. So not only we have all these other stuff why it doesn't sound the same, but now depending on the angle it arrives at you, if it's vertical or horizontal, it sounds different as well. I really do wish I had become an accountant. I mean, this is, geez, one way to make money. So how do we localize sound, and where do those numbers sort of come from? Well, if you were to take your head and you were to stuff a probe microphone down your ear, and then you would turn round in an anechoic chamber with a speaker coming at you, you'd get a polar response that looked like that. Sorry, it's not in colour. I did this years ago, the black and white printer at the time. So this is at the front. So now most people would think, surely we face forwards, isn't it louder coming from the front? No, look at your ears, look at the shape of them and where they're facing. About 45 degrees is where we actually get the most sound coming into our ear. So again, you're setting something up coming forwards, but actually you're much more sensitive to stuff coming from the side. And you're going to get more response. You're going to have a different response at that place. Let's have a little play with that. So what I did, just to show you what goes on there, is that I took a head. Now this actually was not my head. This was a dummy head. Same thing, don't say. Get there first. And I put the same sound at exactly the same distance, and always rotate the head, but we made sure the distance was absolutely the same for both ears. And if you do that, you end up with this plot. So first of all, you see at 90 degrees, you hear the stuff from the 90 degrees first, because that's where the speaker was. Although the one at the front is exactly the same distance away, therefore it should arrive at the same time, you would think. No, it doesn't, because it actually has to come forward and then goes round your head to your ear. So it actually takes a bit longer. So it takes about half a millisecond longer. You think, what's a half a millisecond? That's a hell of a lot. In localization terms, that is a lot. In fact, it tells you the difference between coming from the front and from the side. One of the things. The other thing is that the frequency response is different. So coming from the front was pretty flat, but coming from the side, we've got this boost due to the ear. And I just told you it was more sensitive at the side. And there it is. You're getting, can't remember what the scale is, but you're getting several dBs of improvement, or more high frequency to the side. Luckily, we learn this stuff automatically. We know that happens. But as you turn your head, you're going to hear different sounds. So, interesting. So again, the frequency response will depend on what we're doing. Now let's just put this into slightly more formal terms. So let's take a speaker and hear it from both ears. You have an interaural time difference. In other words, one sound will get to the one ear before it gets to the other ear. And I just showed you on that previous plot. Half a millisecond from front to side. As you move around, you're going to get different time differences. And we can detect those very easily. Half a millisecond in terms of our hearing system is no problem at all. We're into microseconds. All right. So one of the reasons we can tell where sound is the time difference between the two ears of the sound arriving there. And that works really well at sort of mid to low frequencies. Oh, okay, do that then. Then the other thing that's going on is we have head shadowing. So you can imagine the sound coming from the side. In fact, you saw it in the polar diagram, is shadowed at the other ear. And it's a lot of dBs down, actually, coming up to 20 dB down, depending on the frequency. And again, that's how we can tell where sound's coming from, particularly at sort of mid to high frequencies. We can tell where the sound's coming from, again, because of the different frequency balance that we hear between the two ears. Which is why, once people start to go deaf, or they have deafness in one ear or the other, they actually start to lose some of this localization ability. Because we can't do that anymore. I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. And there's actually a measure just showing exactly that. So now you can see the two ears receiving a sound. You can see the difference between the two in time and the level difference, and then you actually see the frequency response is quite different between the two ears. That's slightly exaggerated, but they're real measurements at an angle apart. So that's how we do it. And in fact, that's what I did a measurement of. So you can see, in this particular case, that was at 90 degrees, that was at the forwards, and that was at the back, slightly down. So you're actually slightly different at the back of your head as well. So depending on the angle that you take, you can do a whole series of these measurements, every 5 degrees, every 10 degrees, what you want, around the head. And you end up with a whole series of different frequency responses, depending where you are. These are called HRTFs. Head-related transfer functions. And so you have a unique set. And in fact, you can encode this into various binaural things, because you can say on average it's like that, but you are unique. if you were to measure yours versus somebody else's, they are unique. They may follow the same general pattern, but they will be subtly different. And it's an interesting experiment that if you listen through somebody else's ears, you lose your localization is kind of weird. I won't tell you how you listen through somebody else's ears, because that's...
That sounds bonkers.
Yeah, that's me. But you can actually do that. And it is sort of quite interesting. And some ears are actually, you can localize better than others. So in fact, if your ears aren't actually very good at localizing, you want to localize, you can actually listen through somebody else's ears that are probably more like this, bigger, whatever. Dr. Spock's ears were brilliant. Is it Mr. Spock? No, Mr. Spock. No, that was different, isn't it, Dr. Spock? Quite different. So Mr. Spock's ears were quite different, and you could actually localize a lot better. And in fact, I did meet one guy, and his ears were actually flat like this, and he had no stereo, virtually no stereo imaging at all when he was listening to stuff. So the shape of your ears is absolutely crucial to this. I'm going to whiz past that one because I can't remember what it was all about. I can, but it's boring. So let's just have a look at this. What we do is to also help us when we're localizing things, we move our head, but only fractionally. You don't even know you're doing it. But you will move your head slightly, and this will then start to actually alleviate the problem. So for the moment, if you've got a sound directly in front, you don't know where it's coming from because both ears are receiving the same thing. It both arrives at exactly the same time, and it both arrives with exactly the same frequency response. So you can't tell, actually, if the sound's dead ahead of you, where it's come from. But we can, clearly, because we move our heads slightly. And once we start moving our heads, then we now know what's going on, because now the ITD and the ILD are actually different. And we're just doing this automatically. We've learned this thing how to do it. But this also explains... so now we know where the location is. As I just mentioned, if you actually measure front to back, there is a bit of shadowing at really high frequencies that goes on. And you can teach yourself if it's coming from the front or from the back, but it's really high frequency stuff. You're up there in the 8, 9 sort of kilohertz region before, because it's literally the physical size of the back of your ear that will affect that. So what we do is we do a load of experiments, and in fact you can find it's frequency dependent as well. There's a surprise. Actually, our localization is frequency dependent, but it's not too bad. And you can see that at sort of lower frequencies, we can get down to about 2 degrees under perfect conditions and lots of repeats and trains people doing it. And then, but at a wider azimuth, that was at 0, you actually see we get a different answer. So our ability to localize depends on where the sound's coming from in the first place. God, I wish I was an accountant. So it really is quite sort of interestingly complex. Now this has an interesting sort of application. This is a measurement of, to a dummy head, of a speaker directly in front and two at the side. So what you've got is a stereo phantom image versus the real thing. They are quite different acoustically. You may think they both come from the same, and in fact, one of the ideas I was going to do here was to do the demo, but I can't do it with something this wide. But you can't, if you do it right, you can't tell where it's come from. You think it's in the front, no question. But they are acoustically very, very different. It's just the way we interpret the sound. What's interesting is that the frequency response is quite different, as you can see. And the single speaker in front is generally more intelligible than the two from the side, giving you a phantom image. Even in home listening rooms and stuff where there's not, you're not into reverberation. There's certainly a good trend to show it's more intelligible. Kind of interesting. Let's talk about vertical localization then, because that's quite different, because our ears are separated this way, not this way. We don't have a... If we had an ear on top, magic, we could then actually get much higher resolution vertically. But whatever, I guess saber-toothed tigers or whatever they was went up in the trees or on the top of caves. They were on the ground down here, so that's why we want to know where they were, not above. Whatever. So we are listening vertically, purely in the frequency domain. That's how we tell where stuff is. There's no time difference, notionally, because it's coming from above, both ears get it at the same time, doesn't matter the angle. If it's over there, then you know it's over there because it's horizontally shifted. So it's all frequency response stuff. It's pretty subtle. As I say, typically you can get about a 15-degree resolution-ish. A bit more, whatever, but it's certainly no better than that. And again, if you measure the two responses, you'll actually see you can get different responses at the two, same sound at different heights, and that's all measurable, and it's all wonderful. And it's all due to the fact that our ears have got these crinkles in them. This is all outer ear. Our vertical localization is purely due to the outer ear. So you get these little crinkles, and you see a sound comes in, and it just bounces off. It actually sets up a whole series of comb filters that you then hear later on. And it's these really subtle effects that you then localize vertically, which is why it's very easy to confuse vertical localization with the frequency. And in fact, if you were to do the measurements, you'd end up with a set of curves like that. So these are not as big and as subtle as, they're much more subtle than horizontal changes, but they are there. And you can see they're all very high frequency effects, which is not surprising given the size of the ear and given the size of the crinkling that goes on in there. It has to be a high frequency effect. So again, once you're starting to lose your hearing, then your localization, certainly the vertical plane, is going to decrease as well, which is something that I've never seen talked about, but it's sort of there. It has to happen. Now, the other really weird thing about this is when we hear sound, we automatically think it comes from a particular direction, unless we actually know, for other reasons we don't. So, you know, as you sit in the dark, or you sit in a darkened room, and do the experiment. And if you hear, for example, 8 kilohertz, you will always think, and just play 8 kilohertz, be a burst or whatever, you will always think it comes from above. You will never ever think it comes from anywhere else, because that's how we hear 8 kilohertz, because of those shifts. Now, the interesting thing is that we hear 2 kilohertz from in front, so you generally tend to hear 2K from the front, which has some other interesting applications when you think of what 2 kilohertz is in terms of speech intelligibility and clarity in mixes, etc. And then you hear 1K from behind you, surprisingly. And these are real effects. I mean, you know, these don't just happen in anechoic chambers in research laboratories. Let's look at this thing. This is a nice experiment done by Hannock Lee up in Huddersfield. He did a 1 kilohertz transient, and everybody thought it came from behind them, although it was actually in front. Without exception, everybody thought it was in the wrong direction. And then the other experiment you can do with a broadband transient, it actually moves depending where it was. We can actually pick that up and see what goes on. So luckily we don't just go around listening to 1 kilohertz transients too often, because we haven't got a clue where it comes from. So if you ever do that, think it may not be coming from where it is. So it's a good job that saber-toothed tigers didn't actually make a 1 kilohertz tone burst, because if it did, we wouldn't be here. We'd have gone. And I'd be an accountant. Okay, so just to sort of compare the horizontal and the vertical frequency response changes, but these are really quite subtle frequency response changes that we're hearing. And again, I asked the question, how the hell do we know it's flat? We don't. The other thing, just while I'm on frequency very quickly, is we're actually very good at telling if things off tune, off a note. We can get within 2 or 3 hertz, pretty much. And musicians can get within whatever a semi-quavered, crotchet, whatever it is, thing is. And they can do it, and they get very off-put. In fact, I can remember I got dragged up to a well-known cathedral a few years ago, because I'd done some work out there before, and the choir was saying they couldn't sing properly and they couldn't sing in tune. Well, that was the excuse to the choir master, and the choir master to the director of music, and the director of music to the dean. So the dean said, "Send to Mr. Mapp, send him, we've got to sort this out." So I go up there and they said, "Well, there's this tone, there's this hum." And so I go in this cathedral, I've just driven for 3 hours, my hearing is shot, and I'm trying to find this hum. And I can't hear a hum for the life of me. So I said, okay, look, I've got something else to do. I'll come back this evening when it's quiet, and then I'll go looking for the hum and seeing where it is. And I'm thinking, I can't hear this hum. But then, of course, I don't hear the same as everybody else hears, so maybe I shouldn't. And so I go back at 8 o'clock in the evening after it's all gone quiet, and we're wandering around and I can't hear a hum in the area where the car sits or anything else, it's not until I'm walking past somewhere else and there's some temporary works going on, there's some fluorescent tubes and you can hear them buzzing away quite happily. Yeah. There it is. I mean, oh, it's a buzz, not a hum. Oh yeah, I heard the buzz, I was listening for a hum. And sure enough, we found the buzz and I found the culprit and we sorted it all out. So again, it's how we use the words sometimes. Can be very off-putting. But they ranked it would put them off singing, which, fair enough. I just thought it was a fluorescent tube going. I can't sing either, so that's all right. Now then, this is where I was going to give you a really wonderful audio demonstration. So I tried this out during the coffee break and plugged the thing in and it's blown my sound card completely. So all audio demos are off, I'm afraid. So we're going to have to miss that one, but it was really good. I mean, it was really good. What it was actually was this, if you look at the Eichler thing, it was a never increasing tone. So what you hear is this tone that you think is increasing the whole time, but it doesn't actually. It's exactly the analogy of that. You have to muck about with phase shifts and all sorts of stuff to do it, but you can actually get this tone that you think is rising in frequency, but it's dead flat. It's the same tone in terms of frequency. So again, we can fool our ears quite a lot. And this was another stunning demo, which I will talk about. Let's actually just do that. If you were to play a series of harmonics, you hear a note, you can take the first one out and you don't hear any difference at all. You can actually, it's called the missing fundamental. What it is, the ear will fill in that missing one, because it's the first one that actually gives you the tone of the sequence. It actually sets the tone of the whole thing. That's actually quite a useful thing, because if you do this at low frequencies, what you can do is to remove the low frequency, or you can augment the low frequency by putting in some harmonics. And this is how a lot of various bass enhancers actually work, by putting in a series of harmonics with a tone. It's also got some interesting applications for discos and other things, that you can actually reduce the bass physically in the room, but you will still hear it. So everybody's happy. And the wall's happy because it doesn't see as much bass going through the wall, and the neighbours are happy. So you can use psychoacoustics sometimes to actually do this stuff. So you can all imagine that, I'm sure, because it was a stunning demo as well. Right, so we can get rid of that. On our allied sort of topic, let's talk about masking and frequency masking in particular, because again, this has real applications in what we do. You may not think that, but it does. If you look at our hearing system, on the basilar membrane, we've got a series of filters, and that's how we actually divide up and actually determine frequency. And they're approximately a third octave. This is where the third octaves come from. They're not quite, but they're close enough. But the hell this. They're close enough for this discussion anyway. So you have a whole series of filters, and they're pretty sharp, actually. They are really quite well tuned. But what's interesting, as the sound gets louder, they actually become slightly detuned and they become wider. Now that actually has some interesting application later on. If I remember, I'll talk about it. So that one actually is at 1 kilohertz and various SPLs. You don't normally see it plotted quite like that. You're more likely to see, if you read the books, like that on a log scale. Now you can see really how narrow those filters are. And again, at higher levels, you can see how wide they become. And that is one of the reasons why, if you're in a noisy restaurant or whatever, at a high noise level, you can't hear, the intelligibility reduces, because these filters are not filtering out the noise in the same way as at lower levels. And as you get older, these filters become wider as well, which is why so older people in noisy environments actually have struggled, because their filters are not as good to actually talk from mutter or whatever it is. And that's sort of a classic one. So now let's look at masking. And what happens is, if we were to play, there is actually a tone playing at this frequency, we can't hear anything happening at higher frequencies. We've got a thing called the upward spreader masking. Let's put it into a better diagram. So let's just take this one, for example. We have a tone here that's actually playing quite loud. It's at 500 hertz. And anything in this grey area is masked. Our ear cannot detect that there's a tone there. And again, I got a really nice little demo. I was going to play you two tones. Well, I was going to play you one tone because you think there'll be one tone, but actually two, because I actually masked it. So if you had another tone, for example, even at 2 kilohertz, a nice pure tone where we're most sensitive, you still wouldn't hear it if it's below the threshold of the masking. So it can actually be quite loud. Now that's also true for narrow bands of noise. You get a slightly different curve, but it's basically the same idea. And you get most of the masking actually occurs at higher frequencies, which is why it's called the upward spreader masking. You do get some at slightly lower frequencies as well, which is downward spreader masking, funnily enough. And if you do it at different levels, you can see how it changes. So basically, this is a 2.4K tone, and you can see it's playing at sort of 85. And actually, you need, even at 4K, an octave above that, you've still got to be at 80 dB before you can actually start to hear that tone. Anything else below that, you won't hear. Now, this has interesting implications for emergency warning tones and signals, for example. It is very easy to mask the tone if it's a pure tone or even a narrow band of tones within the third octave or within that narrow strip. And it's loud, you won't hear other sounds going on. And so that becomes interesting. It becomes interesting when you have multiple alarms going off, as in emergency wards, etc. And the number of monitors, there was an interesting study done by a paediatrician, and they reckoned there were 25 different sounds and monitors going off in this one emergency ward room at one time. And you couldn't hear some of them because they were masking the other ones. So actually you need to sort of look at that. It's another reason that NASA spent a lot of time looking at aircraft, fighter aircraft cockpits and even the shuttle, by putting warning tones, making sure that they were well separated so that one was not confused with another one. You can actually separate these two out in frequency. That's a boring curve, but it actually shows how wide the filter becomes as it gets louder. I couldn't make it more interesting, I'm sorry, it's just a sort of curve, you know. So here's one with some colour in it to make it a bit more interesting. Again, now you can see the downward spreader masking that occurs with the same tone. Again, so it's all around that area, but it's much more prevalent at higher frequencies. Now let's put that into practice. This is the measurement of speech going through a real sound system. It was a bad sound system. Didn't have much frequency response in it, but that was what happened. These are actually now in ERBs. They're not in normal third octaves, but don't worry about it. Just think of them as a third octave. And what's that showing you is that all that stuff there is masked. You cannot hear it. And we're losing a lot of the intelligibility of those frequencies. They're just not there. So that poor system actually was unintelligible for numerous reasons, but one of them was due to this masking. And that's why if you EQ a system, if you reduce this level here, then that masking curve changes. Or if you increase these, that masking curve changes. So a lot of the time it's actually masking that's actually causing those issues. And again, for alarm tones, that's really quite important when you look at the background noise or other tones that are going on that you want to hear. So it's just saying, oh, it's 10 dB loud or whatever is not adequate if you really want to be able to prove that an alarm tone is going to be audible. You have to do a much more sophisticated analysis and actually look at the masking of those tones and what's going on to do that. It also has some interesting implications, this masking, and that's basically what's going on with MP3 players. You're looking at the signal and going, oh, I can't hear this bit, so we'll throw it out and we'll reduce the amount of data. And that's exactly what MP3 is doing the whole time. The weird thing is that if you get an MP3 player and you put speech through it and you put it in a really difficult space and environment, it actually makes it more... No, anyway, it can happen. But one of the other interesting things about that is that this leads me on to distortion. And here's a nice little case. So you've got a pure tone masking, and let's look at two loudspeakers. So we stick a signal out. It happens to be sort of down at the 200 hertz sort of signal with two different speakers. There is the masking threshold that would cause, that we know about this, and you take lots of measurements and lots of people and you find out what the average is. Doesn't mean to say that's what you hear, but it gives you an average. And The green one is a good speaker. So you look at all the harmonics being generated by that speaker, and they're all below masking. So you don't actually hear it, so that has a low distortion. The red speaker, you can see the harmonics go beyond the threshold, and therefore you hear those upper distortion components, and then that one will sound distorted. With speakers, you rarely hear the second and third harmonics. It's the upper ones that you tend to hear. I mean, they're there. I mean, speakers are strong at second and third, but it's the higher frequencies that you hear. It's the same with amplifiers or any electronic equipment. It's always the higher frequency harmonics that actually appear to be distorting or give you the distortion, assuming we're not totally overloading and going gross in the whole thing. And again, it's due to masking. And in fact, if you look at the curves, you could actually say, why am I bothering with 0.001% distortion or whatever, because I can't hear it anyway. Well, no, you can't, because it's probably masked. But it depends on these higher frequencies, these higher harmonics. They may not be masked, they may be actually audible. Talking of distortion in speech, you can actually do a curve like that, which shows you how much distortion you can tolerate. Experiment was done quite a while ago. And you can see sort of like 2 or 3%, but it's bandwidth dependent. So you can't just say, oh, everything has to be below 2% or 4%, whatever it is. It depends on the bandwidth, which when you think about it, is totally sensible, because if you can't hear the higher frequencies, the higher harmonics, because they're not coming out the loudspeaker, they can't be distorting, so it doesn't happen. So, so the bandwidth, so the wider the bandwidth, the more sensitive we are to distortion, which is good and bad news depending on how you look at it. But how do we know our ears aren't distorting? How do we know it's the speaker that's distorting or the amplifier? Do ears distort? You bet they do. And you can measure the distortion of the ear. I won't tell you how you do that, but you can do that. Trying to get a distortion analyzer down your log hole is really quite tricky, but it's doable if you're doing it the right way. And you can see here that actually our ears distort at really remarkably low levels. I mean, you can see at about 50 dB, you've got second harmonic distortion. Now, luckily, we quite like second harmonic distortion because it's melodic and tuneful, which is why people like valve amplifiers, because that's all second harmonic distortion. The third and fifth are what comes out of transistor and solid state amplifiers, which is why some people don't like them as much, but for the same amount of distortion. But you can see at actually relatively low levels, the ear does go into distortion, which again is why if you're listening to loud levels, you hear it can distort. Again, this is very dependent, and what happens is a distortion of the speaker or the amplifier, wherever it is, in your ears, the two actually sort of go in series, and you come up with a different number. I mean, it is remarkable. I can remember listening years ago to a really clean monitor speaker, and I knew we were playing it loud, because what happens is this gives you an idea of how loud you're listening to things. Often we judge things by distortion. You know things are loud because it's actually distorting, and you may not be thinking it's distorting, but that's actually the mechanism that we know things are loud. Certainly once you get above 90 dB or so, loudness is really due to distortion that you're listening to. The other thing is that I didn't say I wasn't going to talk about intelligibility. I'll talk about that. But again, if we look at level, you get to sort of 80 dB or so, and speech becomes less intelligible because of the distortion, primarily, actually. We're actually starting to get it distorting and fuzzing away. And this was done years and years ago by Fletcher at Bell Labs in the 1930s, and it's been implemented in other systems in a similar way. There's also a thing called temporal masking. So now we can mask frequency-wise, we can also mask temporally. So if you have a masker, then you have the signal, there has to be a gap before you hear that signal. Otherwise, you don't hear it. It's as simple as that. And it depends on the level of that signal. It depends on the level of the signal, it depends on the level of the masker, it depends on the frequency of the two. But again, you can get this temporal masking effect going on there. So again, we have that in sound systems. It's much more difficult to measure than the other distortions. And again, in the more sophisticated MP3s and stuff, there's temporal masking goes in there as well into the algorithm. Let's talk about hearing and age. You know, that's the threshold of typically the average 20-year-old or whatever it is it was done from. But as we get older, we actually start to lose our hearing, and certainly by the time you're getting up to sort of 50 to 60, you have got quite a lot of high frequency loss, and you may be well aware of it at those frequencies. That happens to everybody. It happens in different ways to everybody, but it actually happens to everybody. In fact, it happens to everybody in such a way that you can actually have an ISO standard to actually tell you if your age and what happens. You can look at the averages. It just happens. Now, you always get exceptions. You get people at late 60s with incredibly good hearing that will still pick up stuff. And you can have people at 40 with bad hearing because of the other way around. And in fact, again, it's a learnt thing. If you spent a lot of time listening to sound and analysing and thinking about it, you can still pick it out even though your hearing's gone down a bit. There are clues in there and you know what's happening. So just because you get to 60, it doesn't mean to say you can't set up an EQ system. Whew, when I get there. That's a relief. Thank God we've got a real-time analyzer. It really depends on the amount of loss, but again, you can see it really starts to kick in. 25 dB is sort of it's termed mild hearing loss, but actually it starts, once you've got 25 dB, you really start to notice things, especially if the other frequencies are going. And you can see with age, it does shoot up there. And this has a real impact on intelligibility. That's just, so we've got age down the bottom, and there's a intelligibility score on that side. And you can see under 3 different conditions, and as you get older, your ability to actually understand words decreases. So that has a real impact. And so something to bear in mind when we're designing systems. Are we designing them for the sort of 20 to 30-year-olds? Are we designing it for the 30 to 50-year-olds? Are we designing for 50 to whatever? And in fact, in some cases, you know what the audience is going to be like. So in fact, you could take that into account. Let's have a look at some binaural things. We've got 2 ears for a good reason. We can tell where stuff's coming from. Not only does that help us localize stuff, but that actually helps us in terms of intelligibility and picking out sounds and discriminating. So again, as we saw before, you're going to get, depending on where the sound's coming from, you're going to get one sound's going to arrive before the other one, and one will be louder than the other unless they're bang in front. Oh, just realised I didn't do something. Never mind. Now, this is where the universities and people go mad because they come up with these stupid experiments that are really quite interesting. If you play some noise into both ears, and then you play a sine wave into both ears, and it's just below the threshold of masking, so you don't actually hear the sine wave, but it's there. Do you see what I mean? So all you're hearing is noise, but there's a sine wave there. But you don't know it's there because you can't hear it. So we don't hear it. Now, if we actually take the sine wave away from one ear, we don't change the levels at all, funnily enough, we can now hear the sine wave. How bizarre is that? And there are other things as well. And oddly enough, if you change the phase of one of the sine waves, it again becomes audible. You're just looking for that difference that's there. Now this has an impact on intelligibility, as I was saying. If we have sound coming from, say, the front, and we have a noise coming from the front, that's the worst case in terms of masking. So we did an experiment whereby we move the noise around the head from the source of sound that we want to listen to, be it speech or whatever it is. And in terms of speech, obviously, you can measure the intelligibility. And what you find is it's quite different there to there. In fact, you can plot a curve that looks like that. And you'll find that when the noise is from the side, but the sound that we want to hear is from the front, we actually get more intelligibility when the two are at the front together. So we're not changing the signal to noise ratio, we're just changing the spatial orientation of the two sounds. And that gives you enough for the ear to actually figure out going, oh, that's that one, and that's that one, and you can separate them out and actually start to get more intelligibility. And this has been used a lot. It's called binaural release the spatial masking. Again, NASA did this so that in cockpits and things, you separate warning sounds out. So it's coming from different directions and different tones and different things, and it's much easier to listen to. There's some other implications on that as well. I'm going to skip that because I actually measured the correlation of the two signals, and when it's at the front, you get a high correlation, so there's no surprises there. So I want to go on and now look at delay angle. So we looked at noise. Now let's just happen, if we delay a sound, what happens to the intelligibility? And you get a series of curves like that. And again, if the delayed sound is coming from the front, it is not as intelligible if it comes at the same level, same delay from the side. So again, we can separate the two out. So, and this is the same in a reverberant space. If you can actually have, the source of sound in one direction and the noise from somewhere else, you're much better off than if it's all around you. And there are sometimes you can design systems that will then overcome that. The worst thing is to have a piece of equipment that's making a noise and you put the speaker on top of it. You actually want to separate it out, then you'll actually hear it much more intelligibly. Let's talk about visual effects as well on speech and hearing. If you can see the lips of the person moving, anyway, so if you can see the lips, you actually get a much higher level of intelligibility than if you can't. So that screws up sort of PA systems as opposed to sound reinforcement, where actually sort of got one arm behind the back. And you can see there's a huge discrepancy. On average it's about 21%, but it's actually bigger than that. Now that's assuming that the lips and the sound are in sync. If they're out of sync, if you go to the cinema, if you're watching digital TV, or watching my digital TV anyway, maybe all TVs are different, as listeners, you don't want to be in sync. So basically we need to be within about 20 milliseconds-ish. And it depends if the sound lags or leads the picture. We're actually more tolerant if it lags than if it leads. And that can happen, and there's this nice confusion. Not only that, if horizontally the sound and the picture are 11 degrees or so out, it gets really annoying because no longer is the sound coming from the picture. Again, you want to try and get the two together. And again, we can do that. So it's not too bad. And vertically, it's a bunch different actually. We're not so annoying. And once we get to about 20 degrees, it gets really fatiguing and people really don't like it. So you've got to be within that. Now, most cinemas and things, you can do that. But it's interesting if the two don't tie up. And it's not the fact you're subconsciously lip reading, you're looking at the mouth the whole time. You're doing it totally subconsciously. And in fact, there's some famous experiments where you can actually change the sound of what you're seeing and what you're hearing, but you actually hear what you're seeing and not what you're hearing. Yes, that's right. So again, you don't want to believe your ears. That's about the last thing you want to do in this job. So we just have a quick look at reflections. How are we doing? Oh yeah, another 3 hours. That's good. What happens? I'm going to get onto the Hasse effect because it drives me nuts. If we hear two sounds and they're separated by a small amount of time, maybe 25 milliseconds, we generally hear one louder sound. And so the psychoacoustic sort of element, or the perception, although we may have two separate events, we hear it as one, which is just as well, otherwise you wouldn't be able to exist in any living room or any small room because you'll be hearing echoes and you'd never be able to do anything. It's sort of 25 milliseconds-ish. Once we get up to sort of a separation of 25 to 50, the effect starts to break up. Again, it's very dependent on the listener and the situation you're in and other things going on, but it's around about that. And once you're over 70 milliseconds or so, it's a definite echo. But it's not a grey, it's a grey area, it's not there's an echo definitely at 56 milliseconds or something. It depends on the level, it depends on the room, it depends on other reflections in the room, it depends on the reverberation time of the room, it depends on the material that you're actually listening to. But obviously, we can use this when we're setting up a sound system. If you do that, the speakers are too far apart, we end up with an unintelligible mess, or you try and figure out what's going on. Obviously, we just used a delay line and align them all up. Lo and behold, it's no longer blurred, it sounds all intelligible, and it's wonderful. So that's good. But how precise does that alignment actually need to be? Well, I've given you a clue just beforehand. And this leads me into the Haas effect and other urban myths. The Haas effect is probably the most known psychoacoustic effect, and it's the most misunderstood effect. Very few people actually seem to think. The sort of the general urban myth is that you can be up to 10 dB louder, up to about 35 milliseconds or so, and you don't lose localization. That is a complete and utter myth. It took me years to figure out that it was a myth because I could never get more than about 5 or 6 dB. And I thought it was me, but no, it's wrong. You actually have to go back and read the paper and what actually Haas did. There are two things. If we play speech at various levels with various delays, we're actually very good at knowing that we've got a delayed sound, and it's 15 dB below the main sound, and we can detect that there's another one there. That's incredible, 15 dB down, and we know it's there. And that depends then on the delay. If we increase the level of the second sound, before the image shifts, there's a kind of a window between those two. And with a bit of luck and the following wind, you might get 5 or 6 dB actually gain from the second sound before you actually lose the localization. But again, it depends on many factors. Many factors. And if you set your system up for speech, I can remember going to a theatre and underneath the balcony delays were spot on, everything, localization was great, we got the intelligibility so I didn't know the speakers were there. And then there were some transients in the performance, and right away you just lock on to the speaker above your head because it's very different. So the way we detect speech and other sounds is different. You can do plots of delay disturbance, which is what we need to do. And this is incredibly dependent on people. And I'm going to scoot over that one. Yeah. These are some, measurements. So 10% of the population say we're actually annoyed at 40 milliseconds in this experiment. But actually, if you go to this one, 20% actually we're quite happy at 70 and 55 and at much higher delays. So it's very dependent. So just because you hear a delay doesn't mean to say everyone else is going to hear a delay. And just because you're annoyed, it doesn't mean to say everybody else is going to be annoyed. It's a huge range. I mean, I was designed for the 10%, and I seem to be in that category. But it's interesting. And one of the experiments that Haas did was to do exactly that, and that's a kind of a transcribe of it. And you can see here that basically, if I put a red line on it, you can see where we go. There's the 10% annoyance threshold. If you're 10 dB down, nobody was annoyed. But you can start to see here that even at -6 or -3 down, people were starting to get annoyed. But only sort of 10 to 15%. 20% were quite happy. In fact, you think about it, 50% of the people were quite happy with a delay that was 10 dB or 0 dB, which would drive the other lot mad. I mean, the difference is huge. You know, I mean, if you're annoyed at -6, think what you're going to do when you hear +10. You know, crazy. So, big variation. So again, we all hear differently, and we all interpret differently. I'm just going to whiz through what Haas actually did. For a start, he had a left and right stereo system. Right? He was playing around with phantom images. He wasn't playing around in theatres and concert halls and sound systems outside. Never occurred to him. He was doing it this way. And what he was trying to do was to actually shift the image from the centre to the side. So what this has to do with what we use it for, I have no idea. It has nothing to do with it whatsoever, apart from the fact it gives you some interesting things. So I'm going to whiz over it. But basically, if you read the paper, that's what it's all about. Nothing to do with how we kind of use it. And then you get a pretty graph like that, and you can learn all sorts of things from it. And this is where the 10 dB sort of misunderstanding came from. So you can go and read the Haas paper. It's been published for years. And he did the work in 1949, so it's been around for a while. He doesn't read my paper, so I don't read his. But And funnily enough, he wasn't the only one doing the work. There were lots of other people doing it around about the same time, but he's got the name for some reason. And that was a graph that, in fact, Samwai showed you last year, which is one I produced a long time ago, that just kind of summarised the whole thing. So that basically you get, this is for speech, you get a threshold, you can start to hear there's a problem. At longer delays and lower levels, you actually get spatial impressions, so the whole thing seems wider. So you can change the image and make it wider. Then you get an image shift, sort of not much more than 0, 2 or 3 dB, and the whole image can shift. But it's in sync, if you like. So it's a difference now between localization and intelligibility. There's a bit of a trade-off. And as I sort of hinted, if you go to a theatre and you want to delay these speakers, that's fine, you delay them. But they're now coming from overhead. And it doesn't really matter how well you delay them. The ear's going, hey, about, there's a speaker above my head, because it sounds different to the one that's coming from this angle. That's 90 degrees difference, or whatever it is. So there's always that thing. You can't fool the brain all the time. You can do some subtle things. There are some really nifty tricks you can do to those speakers to actually make them disappear, but not many people sort of do that. Much better is to put the speaker here so the angle is decreased and it's actually in line with the whole thing. And then we do the same thing obviously in churches and cathedrals and that stuff. We just want to try and align it. We want to do it for intelligibility and maybe localization, but I always go for intelligibility rather than localization in those cases. Ah, God, we're getting to the end. Yeah, that's all that stuff. So basically, it's everything I just told you about how you align stuff, because also in this, it depends on the hearing acuity of the listener. It really is quite important. I wanted to get on to one little thing before I finish. Oh. I ain't going to say a word. Not a word. There is a misconception that certain well-known intelligibility metrics, how about that? God, I closed that one. Don't really take the effect of delays into account. That's a well-known one that we all use. That's Alcon's from the States. It was there before. Actually, no, it doesn't come from the States. It actually came from Holland. But they have the same sort of basic trend that you only get down to a certain amount and then actually it doesn't make any difference. Objectively, that's true. Subjectively, we all have a different view on that. And so that's where it comes from. If you actually do a subjective test rather than an objective intelligibility test, you get totally different answers and you get annoyance. But in fact, you're really annoyed and therefore you don't think you can understand it, but you can when you do the experiment, which is quite interesting. There's always this thing, can blind and sighted leaders, can blind people hear better than sighted? The answer in terms of echoes, yes. You can actually do it at half the level, or a sighted person needs to be twice as loud before they can actually pick up reflections and things in a room. Again, it's learnt. I don't think the hearing mechanism is any different, it's a learnt response. You learn to know what a reflection sounds like. You learn to do things with it. But it's a very sort of, it's there. Have I got 5 minutes?
Should we don't have 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Funny enough, we're talking about latency, so it's about right, actually. It's quite appropriate. Just a couple of things on this, because it's becoming an important issue, certainly for harder hearing type people. And as we're going more and more digital systems, there's actually latency built into them, be it an amplifier, loudspeaker, or the processing. And in some cases, the latency is not too bad. You don't really know it's there. In other cases, it can be quite dramatic. And also, smart devices can have huge latencies built into them. And they are being used more and more for assistive listening systems. Now, as you take your phone along and you'll listen to it, it's broadcast to your phone on Wi-Fi or whatever, even Bluetooth, and which is great in one respect, except if you measure the latency in a smartphone, it can be anything from 20 to 100 plus milliseconds. So you're way out. There was one measured at 300. That's now gone. But up to 100 is not uncommon. So you've got this massive latency built into that part. And you're hard of hearing, so you're struggling anyway, and then you're struggling against the latency of the thing. So it really needs to be sorted out. And Bluetooth can actually be quite wide. If it's a wideband Bluetooth, the latency in that can be quite high as well, actually. The other thing is that Bluetooth, there's no standard for Bluetooth for devices, so everyone's different. So until that gets resolved, we're not going to get further. I mean, the distances are sort of going up. Interestingly, for musicians with an in-ear monitor, 4 to 5 milliseconds is the maximum they can take. After that, they get really annoyed, which is a big difference to the ones I've just been talking about. But, so it's sort of there. And the hearing impaired, funnily enough, are remarkably sensitive to latency and to delays. Anything above about 20 milliseconds will actually affect intelligibility. And even in 10 milliseconds you can find annoying. Again, they are so used to having to concentrate on this thing that in fact you'd think the hard of hearing would actually be less bothered by latency. It's actually the other way around. They really are very sensitive to it. So when we're designing systems for the hard of hearing, we really should be thinking about latency. As I say, smartphones or anything, so up to that, Bluetooth and all that. Interesting, 22 milliseconds for the film industry is the maximum that they would allow for the picture sync and latency in it. And interestingly, somebody asked me this question a couple of years ago, and I sort of had to sit and think about it, and I came up with 30 milliseconds as a ballpark figure. I then did a lot of research into it, and it's just ended up in IEC, well, the number is, we need John, we'll get to tell us all about that. But basically we're saying if a speech delay has to be less than 30 milliseconds in a hard of hearing system, it doesn't have to be loops, it can be infrared, it can be Wi-Fi, it can be Bluetooth, and you want the lip sync maximum of 40, absolute maximum of 50 milliseconds, and that's just come out in the last couple of weeks as a recommendation within the IEC standard for those systems. And it's really important because in fact we can get latency. I mean this is a football ground. People are now putting, because it's in the green guide I think it is, or whichever guide it is, it mentions specifically loops and hard of hearing people. So this is being interpreted as you must put loops in football grounds, which I don't disagree with. I mean, I think there's better technology, but in many ways it's a good way of doing it. And if you just do the sums, that if the roof's about sort of 20, 25 metres up in the air, which they would be in most football grounds, that gives you a 60 to 75 millisecond latency of the sound actually getting down to you. And it's going to be quite loud. You then put the loop in with a 0 signal milliseconds delay. Maybe 5 if you've got a digital amplifier and some digital processing. The answer is you end up with a big echo. And it's disturbing. Because a lot of people still have some residual hearing, or it could be it's in one ear, not the other, and you've got this imbalance. So it's something that we really should be thinking about now, I think, when we're designing hard of hearing systems, is to consider latency. There's lots of evidence, there's lots of papers on it now, and I think it's time. We no longer have a British standard for loops, it's now this international thing, but it's been put in there. Otherwise, it would be in that one. So as an industry, I think we really should be thinking about it. And I won't talk about what the response should be, because that's all different anyway. So we know it's not flat. OK, that's it. Thanks very much. I'll come back next year and play you the demos.
Ray! Would anybody like to ask Peter a question?
No.
No?
Lunch is...
Lunch is looming, but we do have a question. Alex.
Oh, God, it would be you, wouldn't it?
As always, even for us acousticians, there's always something new to learn. It's just regarding one of your slides right at the beginning. You showed some hearing mechanism, frequency response curves, spectra, I should say. And for the left and right ear, for the vertical, in the vertical plane, at different angles. And I noticed, I think it was at 30 degrees, somewhere in the 4 to 6 kilohertz region, there was a marked difference between the left ear and the right ear response. I just wondered if you had any biophysical explanation.
The guy who had his head like that, you know, rather than
why that difference occurs.
No, I mean, that, again, each ear can be different. And in fact, if you measure your left and right ear, they're not necessarily the same. They're really not. You know, they look similar, but they may not be. And it only takes a tiny amount of change to actually do that. No, I agree. I noticed that. At that point, I was thinking, shall I just put the left ear up and then we'll sort of know, you know, get rid of the question. But well spotted. That's.
I just wondered fundamentally why there even were two sets of frequency responses for either ear. I would have just. Wouldn't you just expect them to be the same?
No, you measure individual ears and you get different answers.
Even if the source is exactly zero.
It should be. I mean, I agree in that case it was quite you know, it was quite pronounced.
Yeah.
But you've only got to be a little bit out. Equally, it depends how the measurement was done. Were they done sequentially or were they done simultaneously? So was the head slightly moved? Unless you actually clamp somebody's head into a, you know, into a device. And that happens, you know, sometimes you have to do that. You've only got to move it a fraction and it will change.
Response,
yeah. So, and again, as I was showing you, we all move our heads around and listen to sounds and stuff. We can't help it. So you've literally got to clamp somebody so they can't move when you're doing these tests. Yeah, it's an interesting point.
That's a biophysical response rather than
Yes.
acoustical factor.
Yes. Yeah. But an interesting one. I will write to the people from 40 years ago and say, do you remember when you did this experiment? But, what happened? And why did you publish? Yeah, but no, it is. I'm just amazed at the small variations that you get when you actually move your head in any angle. And that's learned. You know, all those responses are learned. And therefore we know what it does. It's like seeing the colour green, you know. What you see green and what I see green could be completely different, but we know it's green. Unfortunately, you can't say that with good sound. You can't say that that's good. Actually, most people know what good sound is. A lot of people just don't know what bad sound is. And if we could sort that one out, then we'd be a lot better off. Anyway, right.
Thank you, Peter.
all
Thank
right.
you very much for informing us of some things that we didn't know and some things that I'd definitely long forgotten. So thank you very much for the refresher as well. And also thank you for not mentioning those three little letters. Somebody once said to me some years ago when I asked them if they were going to come along to the conference, why would I come and hear either you or Peter Mapp banging on about STI? Well, there you go. Sorry you're not in the room, matey, but this is like the third year running. Nobody's banged on about that. I appreciate you keeping that record going, Peter.
That's all right.
We have lunch now.
Actually, you just reminded me, sorry.
That's all right.
I've got to say this, that tomorrow, the new SDI standard actually comes out for voting.
Wow.
So
Okay.
talk about timing.
There you go. Well, I'm sure. No, I can't promise that we won't have a lecture on that next year. We look forward to seeing that. They say there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, we're here to prove that's not true. Lunch is being served very shortly. Please do take advantage of seeing all the wonderful manufacturers and people that are here to show you their wares and talk to you about the latest techniques. We will be back after the lunch break with our final lecture of the day. Thank you all very much, and thank you to Peter and Martin for a lovely morning.